I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, everybody. My name's Arwen Bird. My organization is called Woven Strategies LLC, and I'm helping to coordinate the tribal climate camp through affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. So, hi.
All right, thanks. And Lad, I know you'll introduce yourself later on, so if you just want to give a quick introduction now, but we'll go from there.
Sure. Keith, Director of Academic Initiatives at the College of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape Architecture.
All right, thanks. Trisha? I'm not sure if Trisha has a mic. We'll go down to the next one. Anita? Press unmute. All right, Anita does not have a mic. So if you don't have a mic, you just type in your introduction there. David? All right, next one, Carletta.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone.
Do you just want to give a quick introduction, Carletta?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carletta Chief. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Sciences at the University of Arizona, and also a core faculty member of NNCAP and CCAS. My area is hydrology, and I work with tribes on climate change issues, mining, and water management challenges. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Kathy Lynn?
Hi, this is Kathy Lynn from the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project. And I'm also here with Maya Nix and Haley K. Scott, who are both student interns with the Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Project.
Thanks. And Katie Spellman?
Hi, I'm Katie Spellman. I'm joining from Fairbanks, Alaska at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I work at the International Arctic Research Center doing interdisciplinary work on ecology and education. And you'll hear more about it in a few minutes.
All right, thanks. And so for those that don't have a mic, anybody can just read the introductions on the chat box. So there's quite a few people. But with that said, I believe we'll start with Katie, if that's okay, and we'll start that round. And so, Katie, I think both of you guys can share your screen, so you can do that now.
Okay.
We'll see if it works again.
And let's see.
Yeah, I got your PowerPoint.
All right.
All right, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks for joining this call, everybody. So my name is Katie, and I grew up here in Alaska. Right now, I just got promoted from a postdoc to a research associate at the University of Alaska. And when I was a little girl, I had giant glasses, and I was in kindergarten, and I was in this science fair, and this woman, I did this project. It was like, how do colors blend, right? And it wasn't that a spectacular project, but this woman named Dr. Sparrow, Dr. Elena Sparrow, she handed me an award that said, "You are a woman in science." And my mom, I went up to get the certificate, and my mom, she said, "You know what, Katie? You could be a scientist someday." And then fast forward 30 years, and the same woman, Dr. Elena Sparrow, was at my PhD dissertation defense, and she said, "See, Katie, you could be a scientist." And I share that story because a lot of the power of multiple generations is long-standing relationships between elders, youth, and scientists that make a powerful impact on kids' lives, as it did on my own life. That simple act of somebody believing in me made me actually pursue science as a career and want to do it to make a difference in my community and come back to my hometown, Fairbanks, Alaska, where I was born, to make a difference here on climate change issues. And so Elena Sparrow, the day after my defense, she said, "You want to write a grant together to NASA and see if we can get kids working on climate change issues throughout Alaska in partnership with elders and scientists?" And I was like, "That sounds great." And then NASA ended up funding it, and the project that we came up with was Arctic and Earth STEM Integrating Globe and NASA Assets. And at its core are long-standing relationships and intergenerational relationships to make a difference in communities trying to adapt to the rapid changes occurring in the Arctic. And we have a lot of collaborators on this, including some of the key collaborators. Dr. Elena Sparrow, she's the one with the pink neckerchief in the corner there, and she's the woman that changed my life and hired me today. And we have collaborators from the Alaska Association of Interior Native Educators and Kanaitse Indian Tribe, and then a bunch of different school districts throughout Alaska, and lots of NASA and Arctic scientists are part of our team. So Elena, she's her focus it really is relationships with people, and though she is a scientist and I'm a scientist, she brought together this great team, and we said, okay, who do we want to reach? And we thought that the key to building those sorts of relationships between youth, communities, and elders, that we should maybe start with the educators, including pre and in-service teachers and informal STEM educators. 4-H is one of our key partners on our project, and really community leaders and elders and tribal council and town council members were some of our focus. And our secondary audience were other educators and students in underserved in STEM. And then we said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to develop high-quality climate change education program. We're going to engage educators in climate change learning, and then we're going to have them do some sort of develop a project that uses NASA and citizen science to directly address a climate change challenge in their community that is co-identified by the elders and the city council and the kids. So this is what, and then we were like, when we actually got funded, we were like, how are we going to do this? And we imagined that citizen science was a mechanism that we could use. Most of my dissertation research looked at the way that citizen science can build bridges between communities and scientists to help build resilience in communities. And citizen science is collaborations between scientists and anyone else to conduct scientific research. And I've been dabbling in it for the past 10 years. But one of the real challenges in the Arctic is that the effects of climate change here are affecting us at multiple scales, from local scales, people's livelihoods being directly challenged, to regional and global scales. And we thought that citizen science could be a mechanism to do this because it can span this spectrum of need, from large-scale needs, where someone thinking about the whole region might come up with a question and figure out a way to address that question, all the way to local community needs, where a community itself might identify the need, and then a researcher might assist them to develop a project. And we thought that being able to use NASA assets to address some of the large-scale issues, but also GLOBE, which is a 25-year-old project, and I'll show you that, but it's got a really flexible approach to citizen science, where there's a buffet of options for people to choose from that citizens all over the world have been collecting data on for 25 years. And so the GLOBE program, it has multiple, it stands for Global Learning and Observations to Benefit the Environment, and it started out as a way to engage students in scientific research in partnership with scientists, and it's one of the longest lasting, most developed citizen science programs in the world, and over 100 countries are involved in it. And so by engaging students in on-the-ground measurements of key issues in their own community, but also participating in this project, we thought that we could maybe address the multiple scales that climate change is affecting. They could address their community problems, but also contribute to this body of knowledge that might be able to address climate change problems at a larger scale. And these data are also directly used by NASA to ground truth their satellite campaigns. So the data would be then threefold use. Another great challenge in citizen science is that often it has a hard time attracting folks that aren't urban, suburban, middle-aged, retired, and white. And so we thought that that maybe we could help address this issue in citizen science by really adding that local relevance, using citizen science not to just address the scientists' concerns, which often happens when you use citizen science as a tool for climate change research, but to root it in the issues that were identified by elders and community members working with the youth. And so when we were figuring out how we were going to do this, we started out with a needs assessment, asking our pilot participants, what are of greatest interest? What issues do you want to learn about? What benefits do you seek of a climate change research program that uses citizen science and youth and scientists and civic engagement? And then what supports are needed? And so this table is just how we went about doing it. We coded the application essays and we did some pre-post. And then we looked at other needs assessments that were conducted for our target audiences at a large scale across the nation or across all of Alaska. And in summary, the teachers that we were targeting, they wanted, and this was both teachers of urban Alaskan schools and rural village schools. They wanted to have a citizen science model that braided Western science and indigenous knowledge. And they wanted often, so President Obama a couple years, 2 years ago, he came to Alaska and the whole focus of his trip was climate change. And there were teachers that, saw Obama's plane fly over their town of Kivalina, and their kids are looking up at the plane and they're wondering like, oh, that's great that the president's here, but what does that have to do with my life? Even though their village is one of the villages that is being challenged with the possibility of relocation. And so those teachers want their students to know that it's their life, their kid, their life being affected. But they also wanted their students to gain practical STEM experiences and use real science and real data that their own students generated. And then the 4-H leaders had really similar goals. They wanted their kids engaged in their communities and in STEM. And then the community leaders, they really wanted dialogue across generations and the opportunity to share information across communities and learning from elders and scientists. And they wanted their youth more connected with their community, their traditions, and feeling like they had a purpose in their community, which is with here in Alaska, we have one of the highest youth suicide rates in the nation, and especially in our rural communities, elders and community leaders want the youth to know that they are needed and treasured, and that they are the bearers of our future. And so they wanted some kind of if climate change could be an issue that youth could hook into to fight for, to help their community on, that's what they were striving for. And so we synthesized all that information, and we were like, okay, we're gonna develop this learning program and climate change research program with this centering around this big idea. We can make a difference on climate change issues by listening, inquiring, observing, and then acting. And then we incorporated the same sort of themes that all of our target audiences had said they wanted out of a program that got kids doing climate change research. Climate change influences our lives. Climate change influences Earth systems at multiple scales, and we need that kind of information to understand it. Everyone can do science, everyone. And that they can use local and traditional knowledges and STEM to help their community adapt to climate change. Even these are kids that I work with from, it's a village in the Gwich'in Nation of Venati, and there's their teacher Terry, and those kids felt like scientists. And we have settled in, especially with a lot of input from this, not only our target audiences, but the Association of Interior Native Educators here in Alaska. We've settled in on this learning model that starts with listening to elders and long-term residents about the signs of change. Then hooking that to what the kids already know and what they already have observed about changes in their community. And then co-identifying with scientists, elders, community leaders, and kids, a key issue for the kids to focus their research on. They then do activities rooted in culturally responsive curriculum design that was developed by the Association of Interior Native Educators. And they get the chance to talk with a NASA scientist to further develop their investigation question. Then they collaborate to develop an investigation that will directly address an issue in their community, and then analyze their data, and then apply their data to some sort of stewardship project that is kind of like a mini adaptation project that kids can actually tangibly do to help their community prepare for the rapid changes in the future. And the units that were developed, they're coming available online, and they have focused on some of the issues that many of the communities in Alaska are struggling with, resource issues, including changes in salmon habitat, fish, especially ice fishing, berries variability, birds, and medicinal plants. And so we start out by inviting all the educators and community leaders. They come in a team to a course, and we just taught our course at the beginning of June. And they go through some of the lessons that the community leaders and teachers work together to identify their own personal connections with climate change in their communities, and then scale up to think about how that affects the Earth as a system, and settle on a project idea that they will implement with their kids. And then they go back to their home community and co-develop a project with their students or the youth that they work with to address an issue. And so I just wanted to share a quick story. Here's our family photo album of Venati, one of the communities I've been working with. And so Terry, she came and did our course with the Gwich'in language teacher, who has been a resident of Venati for 45 years, and grew up in Arctic Village at the base of the Brooks Range in Alaska. and they had been noticing roses, berries, as a something that was in large abundance. But Mary Rose, she said, you know, we can't rely on the berries anymore. They're so variable. You know, some years they're really, really good, and some years we don't get any berries, which is a big deal because fresh fruit is really, 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 really expensive in Veneti. And so having the berries in your freezers is an important thing. And so they called me up. They knew that I'm a berry scientist, and they said, come do a project with us. And so we set up, we studied them really close. There we are, really, really close. And dissected the berries and tried to fit it within their seasonal activity calendar, so that the students were interested. You know, the teacher wanted to situate all the learning within the seasonal calendar. And so she said, design me a graph that will fit with my seasonal calendar. And so we made a graph so the kids could see the connections between the things that they were measuring and their seasonal activities. And so they monitored temperature every day. They counted the number of rosehip berries that were still on the bush throughout the year to see if changes in temperature would affect the rate of the berry loss, which is actually one of my research questions in my own science. And then they looked at whether the ground freezing had any effect on when the berries were available. They connected with a NASA scientist who also studies changes in seasons. And then they monitored berries throughout the winter and looked at when they were removed by animals. And then this is them monitoring the way that the ground freezes. And to see if it could connect. And then monitoring the atmosphere using cool apps. And then they were like, okay, we got this data on berries, and now how can we use it to prepare our community for change? And some of the kids were like, you know, we see in my auntie's freezer, we see berries there, and in my grandma's cupboard, she's got these jars of jam that she's been saving for 3 years, which was like half of the kid's lifetime, you know. And so they said, we'll make jam out of our berries and give it to all the elders in our community, which is in these guys are kindergarten through second grade. In this classroom, and they did their own baby adaptation plan to help prepare their elders for times of scarcity, and they did that themselves, and that's what they thought of as their application of their own observations and their own data, and community, and gave several jars back to Mary Rose, and then And so finally, this is Kiana, and I was leaving, I visited several times throughout the year, and as I was leaving, I was like, Kiana, you know what? You could be a scientist. Because I remembered Elena Sparrow saying that to me when I was in kindergarten, and I said, you could be a scientist too. You can make a difference in your community. You can help your community prepare for change. And I think she believed it too. The end.
Thank you, Katie. That was awesome. Does anybody have any questions at this time for Katie? If you have them, you can put them in the comment box, lower right-hand corner.
That's if you don't have a mic. If you have a mic, you can take yourself off mute and ask. Then we'll give it a few seconds. But if you don't, we can also transition to. And while we're transitioning, Lad, if you want to pull your PowerPoint slide up, at least we can get that up right now and go with that.
And we'll have time for questions after Lad. All right, well then if there's no questions at this time, we can do all the questions at the end. So Lad, feel free to start whenever you want.
Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me. Again, my name is Ladd Keith, and this isn't research directly related to the Native Nations, but when Chad and I met a while back earlier this spring, kind of talking about my research area and what his center is doing, kind of saw some overlap between the policy struggles between some of the Native Nations and the cities that I'm looking at. So like I mentioned before, I'm currently the director of academic initiatives at the College of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture. And this research is actually part of a PhD that I'm completing right now in arid lands at the University of Arizona. And I've actually accepted a position, an assistant professor position here in the college starting in the fall. So this will be kind of a continuing area of research for me. So looking at planning in the Southwest and how cities are planning for climate change mitigation and resilience. So currently, like I mentioned, Director of Academic Initiatives and planning faculty member. My background, though, is in professional planning, and I kind of got drawn into the climate change arena through looking at sustainability and environmental issues in cities. So I've worked all over the country, but particularly in the Southwest, places like El Paso, Tucson, Phoenix, Albuquerque, looking at how cities can adapt to climate change and the challenges that cities have with all the other struggles they're dealing with at getting attention to that issue. So it can definitely be a challenge. So like I mentioned, my background is in professional planning myself. I'm actually on the planning commission for the city of Tucson. So even though I've pretty much transitioned over to academia, I still have a professional role in that capacity, which kind of helps inspire some research questions. And one of the things that recently really caught my attention was when the city of Tucson was redoing its general plan. And general plans, as some of you might know, are planning documents that guide the long-range vision for cities. In Arizona state, they're required of all cities of a certain size. So when we were redoing our general plan in the city of Tucson, there was a lot of interest in including climate change as a topic. But as it went through the public process and the political process and business entities looked at it, because everyone has to agree on what the vision for the community is, and then it goes up for a vote by the public. And so it's in the city's interest to get a document together that everyone can be marginally happy with, because if they're not, it'll get voted down and the city will have to go through the whole process again. So when we went through the general plan process for the city of Tucson with climate change, there were quite a few times where I saw with my own eyes the topic of climate change kind of being taken back, or the words being removed, just so that it was progressive, but not too progressive, so that we could get the most votes possible for the general plan. That kind of inspired the research that I'm looking at now, where a lot of cities in the Southwest are looking to address climate change issues, either mitigating climate change greenhouse gas emissions or becoming more resilient to the impacts that we're coming to face from climate change. But they have a lot of political and business pressures to sometimes not be as progressive as they would like to be. So the research questions that I'm looking at are, how are cities in the Southwest addressing climate change mitigation and resilience in their general plans? And do these policy actions actually address the projected climate risks faced in those communities? And then in the future, I'm going to be looking at what types of community attributes are associated with higher quality plans that address climate change and policy innovation adoption. And this research is generously funded by CLEMAS. One of the other reasons I'm interested in this is because working at the University of Arizona, I've seen a lot of really good climate change information being produced, and then you go into the communities and not necessarily all of that information is making its way over to the communities or being used properly. And so that's kind of a thing that I'm trying to address too, is how can places like the University of Arizona produce information that's more usable by communities with the types of actions that they're actually taking at a local level. So I'm looking at different types of policy innovation theories. One of them is regional diffusion. So kind of the idea that policy innovation, which you need for climate change, because climate change is a type of policy innovation, occurs in geographic clusters and it's a regional phenomenon. So it's kind of the idea that if the city of Tucson adopts something really successful in climate change, maybe the other smaller cities around it would adopt it too. So some of the reasons might be for imitation. They might feel pressured to, peer pressure. They might want to do it for competition reasons. So up in Phoenix, you see a lot of the municipalities competing with each other and adopting policy innovations through competition to be more economically successful. And you can be coerced into adopting too, either incentivized or you can be regulated to do it. And then another thing that I'm looking at is internal determinants and adaptive capacity of communities. I think a lot of folks on this webinar are probably familiar with adaptive capacity, but the idea that basically community attributes have a relationship with the types of policies that are adopted in the community. And those types of things are access to resources, so financial resources, or potentially information. Local leadership, do you have strong leadership that's interested in adopting policies? Or maybe a strong business community component that's interested in being progressive and innovative? You have the public support, so that can go both ways. You have public support to adopt climate change measures, or maybe you live in a community where climate change is not supported, and that would make it more difficult for the planners to adopt policies. Information and communication, so it's the window of opportunity idea, where if you have a natural disaster or something like a wildfire, you might have a small window of opportunity to make new policies and get new things adopted. And then mandated planning, so maybe the federal government tells you that you have to do something. So I kind of mention all of these because they're very important when you're looking at how cities in the Southwest are dealing with climate change, because all of these theories kind of play into what they're adopting and why they're adopting it. Then another thing I'm really interested in is different approaches in climate change and how urban planners are addressing them. So one kind of school of thought is the dedicated approach, and the other school of thought is the mainstreaming climate change approach. So in a dedicated approach to climate change, you might have a very specific climate change policy plan adopted by the city. So it would be something like a climate action plan. That's kind of a standalone plan that is just about climate change and is really in depth. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have a mainstream policy approach, which is instead of dealing with climate change as a standalone issue, you kind of put it on the table with every other issue that municipalities are facing. And there's pros and cons to both of those, and it's a spectrum to look at. So again, with the dedicated approach, climate change is the main objective of the policy. With the mainstreamed approach, climate change is just one of the objectives. In the dedicated approach, there's a linear policy process. So it's like a special regulation, something that just happens one time. And in a mainstream approach, you're thinking about climate change in every decision that you make. And so it's a day-to-day kind of regulation or process. On the dedicated side, again, we have conformance to adaptation norms as criteria to assess policy outcomes. And then on the mainstream side, performance as competitive criterion to assess policy outcomes. So that really means when you're looking at just climate change in a climate action plan that's a standalone plan, by itself, you don't necessarily compare it to other policies and other things that are going on in the city. But if you're comparing it against everything all the time on the mainstream side, you're really having to think about what makes climate change an issue that people should want to deal with. And so I think you see cities and municipalities, a lot of times experiment with a dedicated approach to climate action plan, and they're struggling currently to mainstream climate change into their policies. That's something that we're kind of looking at too through the research. And so what I've done with CLIMAS is in Arizona, New Mexico, pick 3 pairs of comparative cities. So that happens to be CLIMAS's area, but it's also a good state-by-state comparison too. And so we're looking at the city of Flagstaff, the city of Santa Fe, city of Albuquerque, city of Tucson, city of Yuma, and city of Las Cruces. They're a pretty widespread geographic coverage. And you can see here, there's, I won't get into it too much, but there's a lot of other reasons for the community attributes, like I mentioned, for adaptive capacity that makes these cities interesting. The pairs have similar population sizes. So you can see Tucson and Albuquerque are one pair, Yuma and Las Cruces are another pair, and Flagstaff and Santa Fe are another pair. So similar kind of population sizes, similar geography, environment types, and they actually have fairly similar education levels and economic structures too, which make them interesting to look at. So for the first thing that I did was a content analysis of the city general plans. And if you're not familiar, content analysis is basically a couple of readers will read through the city plans and code them to see what the plans are actually doing. And so to make this an interesting study, what we did was we took a previous generation of the general plans and then the current generation of the general plans to see if cities are addressing climate change more than they used to, and in which areas they're focusing their policies on, and which might be the blind spots that they're not focusing on. Like I mentioned, we had several reviewers score the general plans based on best practices in urban planning methodology. We looked at the fact base, and so that's what types of facts, where are they getting their information from for the general plans, what types of goals, so broad visionary goals are the cities looking at, and what types of specific policies are the cities looking at for climate change. And we also looked at the implementation. So are the plans actually calling for implementation, or are they just kind of broad vision that don't really have any actionable items? And then we specifically looked at what types of climate topic coverage there was, if they acknowledged climate change explicitly, which is really important, because if they don't acknowledge it explicitly, there might be some reason why there's political reasons to hide the climate change policies, and then the strength of the mandatory language that they're using. So just running through some of the results really quickly. We found, and you can kind of see here, it's the cities Tucson, Albuquerque, Yuma, Las Cruces, Flagstaff, and Santa Fe. And then the previous general plans, if they had scores, would be in a darker blue. And so these are the current generations. So you can see that instances of just the phrase climate change in the general plans are much higher than they were before, which was non-existent. So not that surprising, because climate change is a pretty new topic for urban planning. So we looked at the indicator scores again for the fact base. So again, what types of facts are they using in the general plan? Are they using projections? Are they talking about climate change in a scientific way? And we found that pretty much before, Albuquerque and Yuma had a couple of facts about climate change, but in the new generation, you can see that Tucson, Albuquerque, and Flagstaff have increased their fact base, which is a good thing. We looked at the indicator scores for the goals and found that across the board, the goals had increased for anything related to climate change. And then policies, so this was the more in-depth one because there tends to be a lot of policies in general plans. So if you look at this one, there actually were quite a few policies related to climate change before, and those increased across the board, but not by as much as you would have thought. So I'll talk about that in a little bit too. But so increasing, but not by as much as you would have thought. And then this is the really important one. So who is actually acknowledging climate change in the general plan as a reason for doing the policies? And you can see previous in the 2000 era plans, there was no acknowledgement of climate change as a reason to do any policies. And in the recent generation of general plans, it's pretty much gone up quite a bit in Tucson, Albuquerque, and Flagstaff. And then the implementation measures have gone up as well. So what all that means is a summary of the preliminary results. What all that means is basically across the board, the newer general plans by the cities in the Southwest that we reviewed are addressing more climate-related topics in their policies. So that kind of goes, they're trying to address resiliency. Climate change acknowledged explicitly in progressive communities. So this is what types of community attributes. So again, there's conservative communities we looked at and more progressive communities politically. And in the more progressive communities, climate change was openly acknowledged and explicitly acknowledged. But interestingly, in the moderate and conservative communities that we looked at, climate change was being addressed, but it was being masked and maybe not talked about openly. So there's no consistency in communities where they're obtaining climate change projections for long-range planning. So that's really important for institutions like the University of Arizona, because we're trying to get our information to the communities to use for these types of planning efforts. But kind of a review of where they're actually obtaining their information, it was completely across the board. Some were using United Nations projections, some were using the National Climate Assessment, and some were using more local projections. So planners are not aware of where to obtain the information from, which is kind of an opportunity for institutions. No general plans used climate change projections specifically for future land use planning. So that's another really important one, is a review of all of the general plans found that they're not actually using the projections that are being made. They're just kind of generalizing certain trends and addressing those trends, but not specifically for their municipality. So that's an area that we can improve on too. And then this is really important. Looking at those policies that I mentioned, general plans are only addressing policies that relate to their past climate risks, and they're not addressing future or new climate change risks. So that means they're only addressing things they're familiar with from the past, and they're not addressing new things that climate projections are telling us are coming. So that's another kind of blank area that institutions can do a better job of getting the information out there. And the second part of the research was interviews with the professional planners that were involved with making the plans. So more qualitative, asking them questions, figuring out what's going on behind the scenes of the plans. And so to do this, we interviewed professional planners within each of the cities we looked at. And so 2 current planners, 2 long-range planners, a sustainability officer, and then a county planner, if possible. And some of the objectives for the interviews we did, I think we did 38 interviews total. They're about like half an hour to an hour long each over the phone. Some of the objectives were documenting key concerns regarding climate change mitigation and resilience, discovering what types of long-range planning efforts are being done for perceived climate change risks, identifying information gaps and research priorities, exploring challenges and opportunities in addressing climate change, and then learning about perceptions of framing climate risks as climate change. So the last one again goes to that, can they openly acknowledge that they're planning for climate change, or do they have to mask it as something differently? And so still analyzing some of the results from this one, but preliminary thematic results, I have a couple of those to share with everyone. So there's a great deal of consistency in climate concerns within each community. So that would mean within the city of Flagstaff, everyone is concerned about wildfires, and there's kind of consistent storytelling going on about that. In the city of Tucson, there's a lot of concern over heat and drought. And so kind of you found similar storytelling about the types of risks in each community, which is not very surprising. The most commonly referred to risks were extreme heat, extreme storm events, flooding, water quality, water security, and wildfires. And as would not be surprising, Santa Fe and Flagstaff mentioned wildfires as their most concerning climate risk. The most currently commonly mentioned climate adaptations we heard from the planners included green infrastructure, urban forestry, and building codes, which is kind of interesting because those were kind of the silver bullets that the planners mentioned to address everything, which is not necessarily a good strategy going forward. So I think there's some more to explore in how communities are using these 3 topics to address basically every climate risk that they're facing. And then overwhelmingly, the planners told us that a major disaster was the most likely motivator for future planning efforts. So that would be if a wildfire happened in Flagstaff, they would expect to do more policy planning around the wildfire. So that's kind of out of anything that could happen, a major disaster was the most likely cited one. So you see the quote there, never let a good crisis go to waste. So kind of disappointing because if a disaster doesn't happen, then it becomes hard to figure out a way to motivate communities to plan for risks that may happen in the future. So some other preliminary thematic results. Climate change addressed more openly in progressive cities. So this kind of goes along with what we found in the general plans. And we explicitly heard from a lot of the planners and more moderate community conservatives that they attempted to plan for climate change, but they had to mask it in other ways and not necessarily talk about it openly, which is kind of a political risk. All respondents said that the economic case for climate change action had to be made. And so they were kind of grappling with how to discuss climate change, mitigation and resiliency in economic terms. And there wasn't a lot of information out there that they were able to use for that. Resources and funding, as everyone on the call has heard before, I'm sure, resources and funding are the highest mentioned barrier to action for climate change. And so the quote that we pulled out here was, climate change isn't always prioritized by communities because they don't see how it will impact their pocketbooks. So again, that's kind of the mainstreamed approach to climate change planning. Climate change is competing with a lot of other priorities in communities. And what we heard from planners was, unless you can help them make an economic case for planning for climate change, it's going to be hard to raise climate change as an item that will get more political interest. And planners stress the importance of messaging and communication on climate change. So needs to be different messaging strategies for different cultures so that it's more relatable. And we heard that across the board, that climate change is talked about in a way that appeals to scientists, to maybe government staff and officials, but not so much to more conservative people in the community, the Hispanic community, the Native American communities. So we heard a lot that the messages weren't resonating with all of the diverse components of communities that we have. So that was an area to improve as well. And interestingly, I'll mention after we've been doing these interviews since last November through about like March of this year. And so just really quickly, not after the election, but after the inauguration of our new president, we heard the tone towards communication become quite a bit darker. So not surprisingly, a lot of the planners were quite a bit more frustrated after the new administration took over in Washington, that there were really kind of a lot of introspective comments about how we need to rethink what we're doing with climate change and really reach out to more communities than we were reaching out to before. And maybe some introspective comments as well that hiding climate change, so the masking issue that we've seen kind of happen in some of the communities, some regrets that has occurred. And some of the planners mentioned that they were interested in being a little bit more open about it and kind of addressing it, even though it might bring conflict. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. So preliminary takeaways from basically both the content analysis and the interviews. So kind of the summary of the findings so far, many cities in the research are making progress on climate change, although they're not all openly planning for it. Resources and funding, again, were the top challenges mentioned. Focus is on climate risks that cities already know and understand, and not necessarily the future risks that they've never dealt with before. So I think that's a huge area that institutions and researchers like myself need to focus on, is helping them understand the risks that they haven't dealt with before. Research found no focus on new and projected climate risks, and there's a lack of consistency in where urban planners are obtaining their information for climate change projections. So the next steps for this research will be using some statistical models to compare the results that we got with community attributes and seeing if there's any correlation between funding resources, public opinion polls, political voting history, and maybe how much they plan for in the general plans or not. So that'll be the next part of the research that I'm looking at. So thank you, and I'm sure Chad will let you know if you have any questions. Go ahead and ask them.
Somebody already in the chat box.
Great, thank you so much, Lad. That was really, really great. I'm gonna go over to the chat now and see if we have any questions.
And also, if anybody has any questions, you guys can take yourself off mute at this point, and we can kind of do a roundtable. And again, if you haven't used Zoom before, the mute button is on the lower left-hand corner.
Lad, I had a question. This is Katie.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious how much climate change was woven into parts of the plans that you might not overtly expect it, like in, say, changes in infrastructure or food security or stuff like that, outside of the topic of natural disasters.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we definitely have a whole list of which policies it's connected to and not. I would think the ones that you would most expect that came up were water. So drought planning was a big one. And then things related to, like you said, like natural hazard mitigation. I was hopeful that we would see some mention of like public health risks related to climate change or vulnerable populations, and there wasn't much of a mention of either of those two, which I think is an area to improve. So I'd say probably the biggest one would be the connection between climate change and the urban form and the urban heat island was a topic that you could see kind of emerging in the new general plan. So that was something that was a little bit further along than I expected. So that was an interesting finding.
Oh, cool.
And again, the ways that they thought that they could mitigate the urban heat island was basically urban forestry and green infrastructure, which are two interesting strategies, but then not necessarily the only ways that you can do that. So
Neat. Looks like Anita has a question in the chat.
Yeah, so well, I can take this, and I'm sure Chad can help too, Anita. I would say CLEMAS has quite a few local projections that they do. If you go to the CLEMAS, I'll type it in, even clemas.arizona.edu. And actually, currently, what's going on at the national level is the National Climate Assessment, and so that is currently being produced. I just typed that in for everyone too. So the National Climate Assessment does have regional impacts that they talk about, and so we'll be getting an updated National Climate Assessment shortly, which will help a lot too. So I'd say the trick is, even within a region, cities have vastly different types of climate expected projection impacts, and so that's kind of an emerging area of research, is how to take those regional assessments and really make them specific to a city to use. So that's kind of an ongoing area that a lot of researchers are focusing on right now.
Yeah, so I guess to take that farther, so it kind of determines on what questions are actually being asked as far as research and data. There's a number of different universities. I mean, we have certain things that's happening right now, and of course, you want to get into detail. Holly Barton is on the call, as well as Holly is a tribal climate liaison that's hired through BIA and works with Southwest Climate Science Center. She works with me. Dr. Valerie Small is just hired as our research assistant. So there's several different things happening even within our program. But of course, Northern Arizona University, ITEP, their program has a number of different resources. So it kind of is, if you want to get into more detail about that question, you can reach out to either I or Holly, and we can kind of take it there and kind of determine what civic needs you have, and then try to match you up with the right person.
I'll just throw this out there too, that a lot of times what I've seen with city planning, at least, is cities will think they need a detailed climate projection for their city that addresses everything, and but that's not the way that they necessarily plan. So like Chad mentioned, I think it's the types of questions that that you're looking to answer, but a lot of times it doesn't need to be as detailed or as in depth as people think starting off. So.
Okay.
Okay, I think Dennis Longknife might have a question, so I'm going to unmute you, Dennis. Go ahead, Dennis. Or if your mic isn't working, you can type your question into the chat box. All right, well, maybe while he's typing his question, I just wanted to ask Katie, what do you think would be required to do something similar to your project if someone wanted to replicate that to another region? So would it be funding? Would it be the partnerships? Would it be building trust in the community? What do you think would be required for that?
Yeah, I think that you can, with our needs assessment was pretty focused on Alaska communities, but the model is it's really rooted in inquiry, learning, and communication with elders, and so you can do that anywhere. I would say that it helps to have a university nearby and to have the capacity to transport scientists to support the efforts, so that there is a funding necessity to do this, and to build the social network and bringing everyone together. Really, travel is I would say the funding limit that you would need to implement that model. But getting kids to work locally with elders and other experts in their community doesn't take much, and to help them feel empowered.
Great, thank you.
What do you think, Chad? Did you hear anything that you would like say you were going to get youth involved in climate change research in your town?
Correct. And so there's a couple different things as far as the youth component that we're exploring. It kind of determines on, so for example, at the college level, there's a few programs happening nationally right now. One we just talked to is USGS out of Moab, Utah. And so it's something where they're actually looking at graduate students and actually matching them up with universities because they have funding through USGS for that. We recognize, at least here, Skylar is one of 2 GRAs that we have on staff. We have 4 other undergrads. And so a lot of it is, at this point, trying to, I guess, encourage people to go on environmental science related programs to be able to match up hopefully with their tribe later on. Now with the youth component, Holly is on the line, but Holly don't have a mic.
Mhm.
Holly is hosting a camp at Navajo Tech this summer that's focusing on, I believe, what was the age group? 18 to 25-year-olds?
18 and up.
18 and up, which I think 15 people are signed up for. So that's one camp. The other one we're involved with is through the American Indian Education Alliance, which is a nonprofit here in Tucson, but they're doing also an environmental/treaty rights camp, which does have a climate change focus. Also, the end of July that we're involved with, representing one day there. But they have 60 students under the age of 16 signed up for that. So
Yeah.
we're slowly moving into that realm. And I'm not sure if anybody on the line's heard of the Climate Science Alliance or Climate Kids at the University of San Diego.
Oh, cool.
So that's another program that's in the Southwest region. They've done a lot of climate instruction, at least in California. And so we're slowly but surely going to try to partner with them and see if we can bring that to the Arizona area. So I think there's a lot of stuff that's been done out there related to kids and environmental focus.
Yeah.
It's just really finding the right partners to do that here in the Southwest.
Yeah.
And hopefully we can do that over the next year.
And moving, one of the things we keep thinking about is moving the climate change education to the next step, like the kind of stuff that, LAD is doing, like how do kids help their community plan for change and actually mitigate change. So
and it's going to be,
can.
yeah. And I think Dennis has a question, so I'll let Skylar read that off.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So Dennis's question is that for his community, just entered a severe drought in north central Montana, and the end is not in sight. These past few years, we've seen our heat records continuing to break records. 100-degree days are very common now. One of the things I'm concerned about is the soil moisture in our area, and I will be working on with climatologists to get stations put up. How are you dealing with soil moisture and recording it? That's probably open to either Lad or Katie.
We have had some groups that focused on soil moisture as their core issue, integrating youth and scientists and having elders and community leaders identify soil moisture as their core issue. And they have found a lot of value in having the youth being regular monitors of soil moisture. So, we have these downscaled models that can help predict soil moisture from the SMAP satellite that NASA has, but they actually found more value from the kids' data set where they were actually doing gravimetric measurements of soil moisture themselves and going to the kids to get that data. So they're not going to be able to produce the same kind of projections into the future, but they had the on-the-ground data today, So, and that was using those GLOBE protocols that I discussed. So
great, thank you. Holly Barton wanted to remind everybody on the call that the La Jolla Climate Change Conference is coming up. That would be I believe it's in September, the 19th. 19th to the 21st. That's going to be in San Diego. We'll have more information about that on our website, advertising that. Anita Mitchell mentioned that the USDA NCRS keeps up with soil moisture measurements and history. So maybe that could be useful. And Dennis, you mentioned that you're a native plant specialist for the tribe and will be monitoring berry bushes here. So thank you, Dennis, for your comments. We're just over noon, so we want to keep the call within an hour just so that everyone can go about their schedules. But thank you so much, Lad and Katie, for joining us. And we're going to record, we have recorded this, and we will post it to our YouTube page soon.
And last comment, the typical call on this thing is first Wednesday of the month, although next month it'll be moved to August 21st, which is a Monday, and more information will come out, but we're actually going to partner with the California LCC Tribal Working Group team. And so they're doing a TEK talk roundtable that we'll be partnering both of our calls for that month together. And so that'll be August 21st, just to put on your calendars. And we'll hopefully be sending out more information from that, but that'll be, again, a change for next month. So thank you guys for participating, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.